of the cemetery. So I'm going to tell you just general facts about the cemetery, so you will know what you're doing here.
Okay.
This cemetery was opened in 1787. The old town of St. Genevieve was 3 miles south of here, and it flooded in 1785 up to the chimney stack. So when the flood receded, they started moving the houses and everything up to the hills. So it came up this way. And in 1787, the King of Spain gave all of this land to the Roman Catholic citizens of St. Genevieve. So the reason, and if you look around, the hills and the little bumpy things and the swale back here, I think it's because this land cannot be farmed. It's non-arable. So that's why he gave this plot of land for the cemetery. And so it opened up. We have, in this cemetery, we have at least 2 Revolutionary War soldiers that came with the Marquis de Lafayette to fight for America, and then heard about this French community and came here and lived their life out here. They're over in this area. They have a modern tombstone which tells their story. We don't have a spirit to play them, and I wish that we did. And, but they're interesting stories. We have.
So there were Frenchmen that came with Lafayette?
Frenchmen that came with Lafayette, yes. And so they came here because there were a Frenchman here. We have Frenchmen, we have Germans, we have English, we have people on their way to the gold rush that died on the steamboats, and so they stopped and put a little note on them and dropped them off on a little rock landing for somebody to find them and bury them. And you know, that's in the records, you know, wow. They dropped off at landing, please bury. We have people that were just stopping in town before they took their trips going west. So there's no, almost one name and not a whole family that had stayed here. We have a couple of monuments that were to the family, but then the family went west, and so, but we still have a monument to that family. So that's kind of fun and interesting to know. We have a mass grave. The Dr. Fraklin II exploded in 1852, just north of St. Genevieve, and the citizens of St. Genevieve waded into the Mississippi River and grabbed the burnt bodies of the dead and brought them ashore, and whoever was not identified, they buried them in a mass grave in the old cemetery. Now, when we got started with this last renovation, I asked some of the people that had worked around the cemetery, and I said, do you know where the Dr. Fraklin II's mass grave is? And they said, oh, absolutely, it's right over there against the far wall. Everybody knows that. So I was talking to somebody else, and I said, do you happen to know about the Dr. Fraklin II? Oh, yes, it's right down in that corner. Everybody knows where that's at. So I thought, okay, I'm going to talk to somebody else and maybe break the tie here. And so I asked a third person, I said, right up next to Jefferson Street. So I quit asking people about that. We had a ground penetrating radar that came in, and so we had some things that we wanted to find. We wanted to find Native Americans because we had heard that they buried with their toes pointing due east towards the rising sun, and we were pretty sure that they were down in the swale. And so that's what we were looking for there. We wanted to find the mass grave, wherever that was at, and we wanted to see if there was anybody buried underneath the walkway that you all came in, because we didn't want to put a nice permanent walkway if we were covering somebody's gravestone. And so that's what we were looking for, and we did about a third to a half of the cemetery by doing those things. We did find some Native American graves. Later we had an Indian chief and his medicine man who came here and wanted to bless the graves. And I talked to him and I said, if you find any, can you let me know? So as they walked around in the swale, they would stop and he would turn and he would find me in the crowd, and he would go. And they pretty much were close to where we had figured them out. So that was kind of nice that they were doing the same thing that we were doing. We put the pathway in. There was a rutted road that horse and buggies had come in, and they would take the coffins off to go to the burial. Now, if you go to a modern cemetery and you're looking for your great-grandfather or grandmother, you go into the office and they give you a map and they say go down 3 roads, turn left, and count off so many things and go in 5 tombstones. You can't do that here. They just came in and said, that looks like a nice spot. I think I'll bury you right there. And they continue to do that. And the early markings were wooden crosses. Wooden crosses last 20 years, and then they're gone. Iron crosses last maybe 75 years. And the stones, if you're not watching them, they fall down and they sink below the ground. So you don't know where everybody is buried here. And so they would just, well, let me dig right here and bury people. So by 1882, every time they would open a grave, they would find bones. And so they didn't want to open some graves of a cholera victim. They'd had many cholera epidemics, and so there were a lot of people that were buried who had died of cholera, and they were very afraid of that. So by 1882, they decided they had to close the cemetery. And so they did, and Mrs. Valley, Odile Pratt Valley, gave the land for the new cemetery so that when she died, later, she could be buried here next to her husband. So that was a good thing, but when I died, I'm going to be buried up in the corner. I have told a lot of...
We're going to sneak in at night and bury you.
Yeah, I know. I know. My sons will do it. My husband won't, but my sons will come in.
I'll help them.
Yeah, I've got a little spot figured out. I've told many mayors, many aldermen, many city administrators. They're all going to think somebody else gave permission, so I shouldn't film that. But it's just a little corner thing. I can stand up. That's all you have to do. Just stand me up straight. Put me down there. Yeah. And I've been in and out of this.
Just auger a hole down.
Yeah. Use one of those screw things.
With the lime field and wash it down.
Yeah. And but I started when my children were little, and we'd come over in the perambulator, and they get them out. They'd run up and down the hill. I'd throw out a picnic, cloth, and they would lay down and take their naps or lay on top of the tombstones and lay down, and I would be free for a couple of hours while they slept, and it was wonderful. And then when we started doing some work cleaning out there, because when we started, we couldn't even see that stone wall. It was about 30 feet of trees and brambles in front of it. And Timmy grabbed onto some vines and swung like Tarzan from tree to tree. But that was in the 90s, and we were working in the cemetery to try and get things cleaned up. And then we applied to the city, and it was, who owns the cemetery? In 1935, they had a WPA grant to put a fence around the cemetery. I should have gone back. In 1882, they closed the cemetery. And then there was open grazing. So if you didn't have a fence around your garden, cows and pigs and everything just were free to go and eat wherever they want. So they came in here, and the pigs would come in here and graze and wallow on the grass. So in 1905, there was a letter to the editor in the paper saying, the pigs are wallowing on the graves of our ancestors. And when that happened, the state of Missouri, who had buried Senator Lynn up on top of the hill, dug him up and took him out to the new cemetery so that nothing like that would happen to him. And so he was buried out there. Then in 1935, they had the WPA grant, and they put a fence completely around the cemetery. And when they did that, thought that they could bring Senator Lynn back. So they dug him up. He was in a lead coffin that had a window above his face, so you could look in and see him. It gets better.
But wait.
There was a door over it, but the door broke off. So they went out and I don't know who they told, but pretty soon they had all of the school kids out of school to line up and walk past his coffin to say that they had seen Senator Lynn. He's been dead 100 years now. Okay? So all of the kids were here. And for many, many years, when I tell the story, somebody in the back would raise their hand and say, I saw Senator Lynn, and no longer do I hear that, but it was a long time that I did. And I've seen pictures of him. His shirt looked like he had just had it starched, ruffled shirt, fancy ruffled shirt. His bow tie was very crisp and tied neatly. His hair was still combed. And he looked like he had a really, really bad sunburn. His skin had turned darker, but his hair was combed. He wasn't bad, but I think the 5- and 6-year-olds probably were a little traumatized. The priest from the church came with all of the servers out with their lace chasubles and everything, and all of the candles and the incense and everything, to give him a very proper send-off as they buried him again. Many of the citizens came out to say they got to see Senator Lynn, and they buried him and his wife once again in the cemetery. The only thing about this is that Senator Lynn was a Methodist, but the Catholic Church did a great job. So he is buried here. There's a concrete slab over the grave, so hopefully he's not going to travel anymore. So he is back here. Now, Senator Lynn, who's usually up there and will tell you all about what he did for the state of Missouri and for his constituents, was called the model senator, is not here because he has been exposed to cholera, but he is in quarantine right now. So he's not here tonight to tell his story, but he's great to hear, and we're sorry that he's not here, but we want him to stay healthy, and so that's a good thing to do. But in 1935, they put the fence up. Senator Lynn started his traveling, and the city of St. Genevieve passed a cemetery tax. So if you live inside the city limits, you pay a cemetery tax. Who owns the cemetery? Not the city of St. Genevieve, but still they collect money to keep it up. They mow the grass and they do some stuff. If a stone falls over and breaks, they pick it up and they put it down on a pile. And people in town could come in and pick up those stones and take them and use them as stepping stones in their garden or whatever they wanted to do. So we started a couple weeks ago in the paper saying, if you happen to have some of those tombstones, we would love to have them back. But we don't have those little maps with who's buried where, because people just came in and said, I'll bury them here. So we have a spot where we're going to put them, and so everybody will know that they belong here, but we don't know where they're at. So we're happy to get any back that we have. And we don't have all of our spirits here because some of them are afraid to be out in public, and some of them are not well or whatever. But with the cholera, it's that cholera epidemic that's going around. So, but in 1882 we closed down, and in 2004, in the late 90s, we started finding out who owned the cemetery. We had to go all the way back. It's not the parish. It's not the archdiocese. It's not the city. It was the Roman Catholic citizens. So we had to have the archdiocese give us a quitclaim deed, the parish do the same thing, and then announce it in church so that if anyone of the Roman Catholic citizens wished to own it, they had to come forward and say they did or say they didn't. And then with that, the city could take up the ownership, and the Foundation for the Restoration of St. Genevieve does the administrative stuff. We get the grants, and we supervise the restoration of the stones, and we do this. You know. Next year, we're going to have dinner in the cemetery with the spirits. That's our idea that we're working on. Hopefully when we don't need to do it with masks and things like that, but that's our idea that we're working on. So go see our spirits. We have people from anywhere from 1787, though we don't have anybody that old. I'm probably the oldest one here, and going all the way up to 1882, and we've got lots of interesting people to hear. And we're not here to scare you. This is not Halloween. We're here just to give you some history. So enjoy. Be sure you get your flashlights or your lanterns and stuff. Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, so my name is Marie Villars, and I lived in this town for 56 years. I was born May 20th of 1790, and I died May 3rd of 1846. I never married, but I had a very prominent family, and all of my relatives, both those who married in and those who were actually siblings, a lot from town. My mother was Marie Louise Valley, and her father was Francois Valley, and he was actually captain of the militia in the old town of St. Genevieve. My father was Louis de Bril de Villars, and he was actually a commandant in the militia in the old town of St. Genevieve. I had one brother and three sisters. My brother Joseph married Eleonora St. Jean Beauvais. Now, she was the niece of Vital. And Vital, you're going to hear a whole lot more about him as you travel around to the other spirits. He was a very wealthy merchant, and he did a lot of business in both Kaskaskia and St. Genevieve. My sister Marie Mathilda, the whole family had a big military presence. So my sister Marie Mathilda married Philip Francis Camille de Hall de la Sousse. His father was Philip Francis Camille de Halt de Lazes de Louisiana. And he was actually a commandant in the town of Nouvelle-Bourbon. He had a brother named Charles Carlos de Halt de la Sousse. And he was actually the last governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory from 1799 until 1803. So he would have known Lewis and Clark and all the people in that, involved in that whole entire venture that was arranged by Thomas Jefferson. My sister Euphrosyne, and we like to call her Eugenia, she married John Price. John came here from Kentucky. He was a wealthy person, and he built the Old Brick Tavern. And my sister Marcelie, she actually married Best of All. So at the time, there was a lot of immigration in the town, and we don't really think about that today, but a lot of their people got their start here in this town. And it just so happens that a Swiss immigrant came to town in 1810. His name was Joseph Herdich. He was not only wealthy, but he was an educator. And the very first thing he did was build a school. It was the School of the Asylum, and the school was actually located on the river Aubuchon Creek. He was a very different kind of educator compared to what was going on in the States at that time. He taught what is called the Pestalozzi method, meaning he felt that students could learn more from nature than they could just from books. And so the great thing was he took them on field trips. Well, that got a lot of notoriety, and in 1833, Governor Dunklin decided that we should probably let this guy head up the commission to start the first public school system. And so he did. Now, on top of that, he was very popular. And so when they looked at starting a Masonic lodge here, and by the way, it was the first Masonic lodge west of the Mississippi. It was called the Louisiana number 109. They asked Joseph to be the first warden of that lodge, and meetings were held in the Jeannie Ziegler Green Tree Tavern. Yeah. So now you know a little bit about my family.
Okay.
And as you travel around, again, you will hear the same names. A lot of us are all related.
Okay.
And it's kind of nice because it helps give you the whole picture if you can get to just about every spirit.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Suppose you're wondering who I am.
Yes.
That is a good question.
Oh.
There is no cemetery stone where I am buried. In fact, I'm not even buried here. I wandered down from up on the hill. And I'm amongst 40 other people, all buried together.
Oh,
We all died together on August the 22nd of 1852. We were all traveling by the steamboat to the Dr. Fraklin II. And unfortunately, as we went to bed, there was a loud explosion that woke us up. And the next thing I know, I feel hot scalding water all over my skin. And I don't remember much after that, but it has been said that the captain who normally pilots the ship wasn't even there. Makes me wonder if it was someone else's error in piloting the boat. And in fact, 2 individuals who worked on the crew, well, let's just say that they discovered the hat, they've discovered the body, but they did not find what went between. 19 people were identified. And the rest of us, it's a mystery. But fortunate there were survivors, and they were able to travel back by way of another steamboat, the Herman, and it was brought here to St. Genevieve. And it was very fortunate there was a doctor on board from St. Louis who was able to help treat the wounded. So I guess if there's a message I have to give to you is be careful with traveling, especially on new technologies and even not so new technologies, because you never know when it's going to explode on you. Which is most unfortunate.
Well, thanks for sharing your story.
You're welcome. Thank you for visiting this evening.
my name is Genevieve Schwab, and I died during the cholera epidemic of 1854 at the age of 30. At 30 years of age, I was a woman well past my prime. The life expectancy of a woman at that time was 39 in Missouri. I was a school teacher and never married. If I'd have married, I could no longer teach school. That was the law in the country at that time. Cholera was a disease that was transmitted through the water, and many people were getting their water from a nearby creek or a stream, carrying it into their homes in an oak bucket, and everyone was drinking from that same dipper that they kept in the bucket. Cholera was a disease that was also known as the sinking disease. You would get incredibly weak and sink and be able to not stand on your own. By usually day 2, you were extremely thirsty, so they were giving you more water. Of course, more water included more cholera. By day 3, many people were being carried out the door. Cholera was a disease that took approximately 1/4 of the population in this area between 1853 and 1855. Genevieve Schwab was buried here in July of 1854.
I'm Julianne Zucker, and I was born in Bolduc, Germany in 1822. Bolduc is like the sister city to St. Genevieve. I met my husband Lawrence, and we married in 1839, and we had our daughter Sophie in 1842. After we had Sophie, we decided to come to America, the promised land, freedom. But we landed in New Orleans January 30th, 1843, and traveled up the river. Settled here where our family and friends already were, and unfortunately for me, I passed away in March, right before Sophie's first birthday. So, just a few short months later,
I am Regina Zucker. I'm the second wife of Lawrence Zucker. I was born in Freudenberg, Baden, Germany in 1822, and my family decided they were immigrating to America. They were among the first German families to immigrate here. I was only 11 years old at the time. It was very exciting. I don't remember how we got from here or from there to St. Genevieve, but I knew this was always our destination. The Mississippi River and the tall pine trees reminded us of home from the village that we came from. So in 1843, I met Lawrence after Julianne had passed away, and we were married in the Catholic Church, and we moved to an area west of here called Zell. My husband was in agricultural pursuits, and our wealth increased greatly at the time. So we had 12 children, including the daughter that Julianne had. Two of my children passed away at young ages, one at the age of 4 and one at the age of 2 months. And I am buried here. I died in May of 1870, and I was buried in this spot right next to Juliana. So our husband did not let the grass grow under his feet, and he soon married and took a third wife and had more children as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any idea where he's buried?
We think we had the records that we thought he was buried here, but there's no stone.
These two ladies got a stone.
We have matching
Identical
stones.
stones.
They're identical. Matching
Yeah,
stones.
that's great.
I am Dennis McGill, and you're probably in what I'm going to call the Irish slum here in the cemetery, because there aren't a lot of Irish buried here, but I am one. And I'm able to get away with a lot of tall tales because not a lot is known about me. I see here that I died when I was 33 years old, but it doesn't say when I was born. It does say that I was a native of Killybegs, Ireland, which is famous because one of the ships of the Spanish Armada lost its rudder and landed in Killybegs, and the good Catholic people of Killybegs basically housed the sailors and repaired the ship. And you've heard the expression Black Irish, the Irish who have curly black hair. They are supposedly descended from some of the sailors from the Spanish Armada. I was a working man, and on this side of the cemetery, or the stone rather, you'll see that this is erected by my shopmates. And I was a stonemason, and you'll see some of the tools of my trade up here. So while not much is known about me, it's pretty clear that my shopmates thought very highly of me because they put up this fine monument. To the right of the monument, you'll see this pillar that's not complete, and that was a symbol for Masons of somebody who died at a young age. And while 33 is young now, it wasn't that young back in 1844. The average life expectancy was about 40, 45 at the time. And so I'm not sure if that's connected with this, but it probably was. I likely was not a member of a Masonic lodge, even though you see these Masonic symbols up here, because the Catholic Church at the time had automatic excommunication for a Catholic who became a member of a Masonic lodge, although there's a long history of the Masons in St. Genevieve, beginning in 1807 at the Green Tree Tavern. So I probably was just a Mason, but not a member of the Masonic lodge at the time. And other than that, other than the fact that I was loved and respected by my coworkers, there just isn't a lot known about me.
Bonsoir. Comment vas-tu? Which means, how are you this evening, sir? But anyway, my name is Martin, Major Appel Martin Aubuchon. My name is actually Martin Aubuchon. I'm actually a descendant of Antoine Aubuchon, which is one of the first families here in St. Genevieve. He appears on the 1750 census, and he was one of the 7 families that was part of this town. Antoine came, he was actually originally over in Kaskaskia, over on the east side, over in Illinois. He had come down from Canada to join his brother Gabriel, who was actually a Senate clerk over in Kaskaskia. But then at some time he decided to come over to St. Genevieve. Antoine was a farmer. Let's say there was 3 families, or I should say, let me back up. families in St. Genevieve. It was important. There was a closeness. And then also who you married and what that. So there was a little emphasis on people, but the main thing was there was a close family ties. It was much more important than it is even today. But he was primarily just a farmer. Some of the stories you read about Antoine involve, let me back up. Just because he was farmer, but there are some historical connections. His grandson, Anton Tonish, which would have been his grandson, had 11 legitimate children from a black slave. The slave's name was Elizabeth. When Antoine died, she had actually filed a lawsuit against the estate asking for some remuneration, and she was granted a portion of her estate. She got some of the wheat and some other products, but nevertheless, she did get something out of the estate. There was another incident which involved Elizabeth Aubuchon, which was the widow of Antoine. It involved a case basically it was a combination murder trial and stealing a slave. There was a Métis trapper by the name of Celadon who had come in town. This was in the early 1700s, and he had come in town, and they also established a relationship with Lieutenant Villars, who was the Spanish commandant of the Spanish troops here in St. Genevieve, and there were actually what had happened. There was a murder case involving a Indian gal, which Celadon had taken from Fort de Chartres. She had actually gotten killed that night that he took her, and they had found the body. Celadon also had taken Marianne, which was the Indian slave from Elizabeth, and basically that's the details of the case. But there was actually a court case here in town held by Francois Vallée, the commandant, and also, since it involved Lieutenant Villars, he was associated also because of his relationship with Celadon. There was actually a military trial. In addition to the civil, there was also a military trial going on at the same time. The result of the trial was with the Indian gal, and they never found Celadon, but there was testimony by several trappers that knew Celadon, who had visited him at his camp over on the Black River, just west of here. And he claims he never murdered the Indian gal, but that she had accidentally shot herself. And during the trial, several of the other people that knew him and knew the rifle said that he did have a hair trigger rifle. So his testimony was probably true. When he took Marianne, she had actually had two children, John Baptiste and another one by Louis, and she was trying to take her older son with him, but he said that I cannot leave my little brother. I will not leave my little brother. And so she left both of them with Elizabeth. They left and went over to the areas over on the Black River, and they do. And they were visited by trappers, by hunters, so they knew he still existed in the area. But later, then Francois Valet, the commandant, finally closed the trial, and said that there was no actually murder. But then through the years, the hunters would visit Marianne in Celadon, and she would always ask about her children and how they were doing. And one of the things that was brought out that she said that she wanted to make sure that she was getting a good religious education, because she felt strongly about her Christian beliefs, which she had gotten when she lived here. So that's a little bit about the Aubuchons.
I'll introduce myself. My name is Robbins, Prospect K. Robbins, also known as PK. I was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1782. I was able to get a little bit of education when I was younger, and later on was actually described as a educated man. I enjoyed the math, the science, as well as looking at the stars. In the early 1800s, I heard of this expansion, this westward expansion of the United States, and it intrigued me. So later on, I moved to St. Charles. In St. Charles, I was a school teacher, actually taught surveying, was justice of the peace, and in 1813, I joined the military. My top rank was first lieutenant of Callaway's Company of Rangers, and in May 1815, I was discharged. Later, I received a letter from a gentleman by the name of William Rector. William Rector was the deputy surveyor for the St. Louis area, and he was in charge of surveying. Seems like the United States had purchased 828,000 square miles for $15 million from France, and they needed it surveyed. I went and met Mr. Rector, and at that meeting I met another gentleman by the name of Joseph C. Brown. Mr. Brown was a pretty famous surveyor, surveyed quite a bit of land over in Illinois. Mr. Rector wanted to know if we would like to do some survey work. He gave us instructions. And in the instructions, we were to acquire a compass. The compass was to be of Rittenhauser construction. David Rittenhauser was a maker of very fine scientific instruments. We would require 2 chains. One chain we would use daily measurements with. The other chain was used to verify the length of the chain we were using daily. It's surprising how much wear on each one of these links could actually lengthen this chain. The instructions also indicated we were supposed to meet in the fall of 1815 in St. Louis. And I met Mr. Brown. We had to gather our crew, our supplies, our equipment. We gathered, we got on board a flat-bottom boat and floated down the Mississippi River. We stopped at the St. Francis River. Mr. Brown got out, made camp. I floated on down to the Arkansas River, got out and made camp. A couple of days later, Mr. Brown headed west, using the compass to keep him west. I headed north. The compass was to keep me running north. We were using a chain to measure with. After 57 miles, I intersected the line of Mr. Brown. At that point is described as the initial point. The line I was running is described as the 5th principal meridian. All the deeds in Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Michigan, South Dakota, and part of North Dakota is all based on the 5th principal meridian. That was November 10th. Camped for a couple days. Mr. Brown headed on west, I headed on north. After 357 miles, we intersected the Missouri River. That was December 28th, 1815. We had completed our job. We gathered our notes, headed back to St. Charles. I organized the notes and then later headed on into St. Louis and met with Mr. Rector. Our job was complete. I went back to St. Charles, 1816, married my wife, Elizabeth Evans. We had 2 children, Jesse and Joseph. They had both moved to St. Genevieve. Joseph was county coroner for quite a few years and then moved on back up to St. Charles. Jesse was an attorney. He was a surveyor, circuit clerk and recorder, and state rep for this area. If you're familiar with downtown, just west of the post office is the Jesse B. Robbins house. That's the house he built. My wife always wanted me to be baptized, so in May 1847 I was baptized. June 3rd, 1847, I died, and I'm buried somewhere here in the cemetery.
Do you know who I am?
No.
Then Dr. Carl Eckberg was right in his book, Colonial St. Genevieve, when he describes me as a virtual unknown. My name is Francois Leclere, and I came to St. Genevieve in 1770 at the age of 21, and I came here as an educated man. I came from a little town called Aubuchon in New France. Now, do you know where New France would be? That would be Canada. Quebec, actually. I came from the Quebec area. Aubuchon is a small town. 2020 population would be about 2,100 people. So I came here for a reason. I came here to be the secretary of the scribe for the most powerful man in the Louisiana Territory. And that was a man by the name of Francois Valley, who was the civil commander and also the military commander at the post of St. Genevieve. He was illiterate, and I would sign the documents. He would sign in Valley. I would come behind him and sign my name, his name, Francois, in front of it. But I'm the person responsible for thousands of pages of documents that you'll find in the courthouse and also buried in the vaults of Madrid, Spain. 1776, I married the niece of Francois Valley, Marie-Louise Valley, and she's buried right here. We had 3 children. We had a son named Francois. He died a year before his 3rd birthday. We had a second son named Louis, and he was buried. Louis, and then he was named after the King of France at the time. And then we had a third son. We named him Francois also, and then he was buried here. In 1785, we lived in the old town, 3 miles south of the current town of St. Genevieve, along the river, at the corner of La Grande Rue and Rue de Traverse, which would be Main Street and Cross Street. And the floods dispersed everybody, so we went in 3 different directions. There was a group that went south near the Saline Creek. There was another group that went over the bluffs overlooking the old town, and then there was a third group that came between the Gabourys, which is the current town. We, my family, with Francois Leclere, we went to the bluffs overlooking the town. Now in 1787, they did a census, and they did this because people had dispersed, and that's why they did it in an odd year. And I was listed on there first, which is a great honor. And they listed me as a Labrador. Usually on a census, they would list you as a habitant or a voyer. A habitant being somebody who lives in a house, and had been there for a while. The voyer would be someone who's transient. Again, they listed me as a Labrador, which was a very high honor. 1789, I passed away at the age of 39. I left behind a 5-year-old son, buried here, and an 8-year-old son, and then my wife. In 1792, I was buried in the old town, but in 1792, my wife had me exhumed and reburied here. So it's kind of different. It was unheard of at the times, but she was a very bright woman. 1793, per French custom, they did an estate inventory of all our property. And the property was valued at over 53,000 livres, which translates into about $530,000. So we were very wealthy. But can you tell me what our most valuable asset might have been? Slaves. 40% of our estate was made up of slaves. There were 9 slaves. And then one of them, the youngest on that estate inventory, Mary, 12 years old in 1793, is buried here also with the family. The second most valuable asset would have been ratafia. which is a sweet liqueur. We had 1,200 levures of ratafia and another 300 levures of good wine. So 1,500 levures equal $15,000 worth of liqueur. We were French and we enjoyed ourselves. Now there are 4 generations of the Lecleres buried here. Myself, my wife, my son, his wife, Felicity St. Jimmy Beauvais, which is the daughter of Vital and Felicity down in the corner, and then Decilly Leclere, and then the 4th generation would be my great-grandson, the Lieutenant Colonel. So again, this is all family, the family plot. And if you haven't visited the Colonel yet, I would suggest you can go right there.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Felix St. James. I was born in St. Genevieve on December the 13th, 1830, and I was born to Auguste and Deja St. Gemme. I became a lawyer by trade, and in 1852 I changed my name from St. James from St. Gemme to St. James, and the reason I did that was because I was having political aspirations, and I thought because of the prejudice against French Catholics that was kind of prominent in certain areas in the state, that I would receive more votes if on the ballot my name was St. James instead of St. Gemme. So then in 1853, I met my wife. Her name was Susan Elizabeth Sargent, whose folks are buried here. And we got married. And in 1856, I ran for Attorney General in the state underneath the American Party. Of course, I lost. And then the American Party decided that they just lost interest and they dissolved. So then in 1860, around there, I became a member of the Republican Party and campaigned for a guy named Abraham Lincoln. And after he won election, I had become known in Missouri, especially southeast part of Missouri, as a Republican. So therefore, I received this commission as Lieutenant Colonel of the 13th Missouri Infantry. I was one of those political appointments that a lot of people don't like. But so there, I was ordered in August the 14th, 1861 to report to Cape Girardeau and report to the 8th Missouri Infantry Regiment and to guide them to St. Genevieve to the Merchants Bank. Because the Merchants Bank up in St. Louis asked General Fremont to take their money out of their branch office down here in St. Genevieve, which had $58,000 in it, over $58,000, and bring it to St. Louis. So that's what we did. The reason for that is because there was this guy running around named, we called the Swamp Fox, and his name was General Jeff Thompson. He was a Confederate guerrilla, and he was robbing banks of known Union sympathizer owners and taking that money and supplying his army with supplies. Well, that ended, and then in January of 1862, I in the 13th Missouri was ordered to report to General Grant down in Tennessee. We reported General Grant. We took part in the Battle of Fort Donelson, and then that was successful. And then from there, we went down to Pittsburgh Landing, and we know that as the Battle of Shiloh. That took place on April the 6th, 1862, where I received a mortal wound while leading my men. On April the 8th, 1862, I died of my wounds at a hospital in Savannah, Tennessee. And on April 13th, I was buried beside my father, who had died on March the 23rd, 1862. And I was buried in 1863, too, instead of 1863. But anyway, sorry about that. But my son, who was born on February 24th, 1862, I never got to meet him. I also had a daughter who was born in 1860, and she grew into womanhood. My wife, she died in 1912, and she's buried over in Valley Springs Cemetery, which is a little over a mile from here. And she and I are one of those couples that are separated because we're buried in two separate cemeteries. Our son died in October 1863. And that pretty much, is the end of my story, except in And after the Civil War, there was an organization that became known from the Civil War veterans as the Grand Army of the Republic. So they had a post here in town, post number 326, and they named it after me. I was reported to be the first volunteer to join the Union Army in southeast Missouri. I was the highest ranking officer that was killed in battle in southeast Missouri, so they named their post after me. So in 2000, and every year on Decoration Day, which later became known as Memorial Day, they would come here and have a ceremony at my grave site and lay flowers there, and then lay flowers around the graves of some of the Mexican War veterans and other Civil War veterans. Then in 2009, we formed the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, Camp number 326, the same number, and we named it the same thing. We named it after me. So that's pretty much my story. Do y'all have any questions? And every year on Memorial Day, we have a ceremony over here where we lay flowers and have
Still have it.
Yep, every year. You guys have any questions for me?
No, I think it's cool. You must have you did survive your first wound because you didn't die on the battlefield. How long did it take to get you here?
Well, I died 2 days later. I died on the 8th, April the 8th, 1862. And then I was buried on April the 13th.
So you were transported up here after
Big pardon?
you were transported up here?
Yeah, my body was brought up here. For higher ranking officers, they did that. They would try to deliver them to their family, or during the Civil War, if the family was rich enough, they could go get them and bring them back. But this here is, you can't see it too much anymore, but I have a bayonet.
I saw that.
Yeah, the bayonet, actually, during the Civil War, I've read some memoirs and stuff where the soldiers actually did that. They would stick their bayonet in the ground, and they would put a candle in the bayonet where it's supposed to fit over the end of the barrel or the gun, and they would use that as a candle holder. They would go and sit like beside a tree and do this and read letters from home, or write letters home, or read newspapers. And I know this is a little hard to believe, but sometimes there's even reports that I'm actually gambling around But it's one of those things, that like the government says you'll use this to stick over the barrel to stab somebody, and the soldier says, I have a better idea. Something a little more practical.
Yeah. I am Louis Bolduc. I was born in Canada. My house was burnt, the French and Indian War. My house and my whole village was burnt down, so I came down here to St. Genevieve.
And I will tell you about both of his wives. First wife was Agathe, and her and Louis had 4 children, the oldest being Elizabeth, and she did live long enough to bury her dad. They had 3 sons after that. The 2 middle ones lived into their 30s, and the last one was an infant, and Agatha did die shortly after giving birth to that baby. 2 years later, he married Marie, and she's 17 years his junior, and she was 4 months pregnant when they married, which wasn't unusual in that time. She did lose, that baby did die. It was born premature, and shortly after that she did have another son, and she also lost that son. She did raise the 3 surviving children of the first marriage. There was a little bit of trouble with the oldest daughter, and they made an arrangement for her to live with her godfather, and with the consideration that he would teach her a trade until she married. He would care for her until she married. Marie, one of the reasons she did go live with that godfather was there was some issues. She was a teenager with Marie, and the problem pregnancies, and but they ironed that all out, and they were very good friends later in life, and did live together later in life.
When I came to St. Genevieve, I could only speak French, which wasn't that unique. Everyone here spoke French at the time. I could neither read nor write, nor could I read nor write the rest of my life. However, I was a very shrewd businessman. I owned property. I had mines. I traded. I was a salesperson. I traveled a lot, places like New Orleans. In fact, when I was in New Orleans, was when my first wife passed away. So I was unable to see her until after she'd already passed.
Thanks, Al. I would like to tell you there's a home here, a historic home here in St. Genevieve, the Bolduc home, that originally, when he was married to Agathe, they lived in Old Town. There was a flood in 1785 and destroyed that home. They did salvage. The people from St. Genevieve did salvage what they could from what was left there after the flood. They rebuilt here on South Main Street. It's one of the oldest buildings restored. In the building, they've carbon dated the wood. They're pretty sure some of it was the salvage wood and some of it's new wood. There is a piece of furniture there that there is a watermark that you can tell where the flood came into their home, and it's an existing piece from the late 1700s that is in that home.
During my travels, there's a number of records that show some of the things that I was involved in. There was a family here in St. Genevieve that promised that they would free their slaves once they died. They did pass away. One of their slaves ended up in New Orleans, and New Orleans was in custody. So I went up there to help vouch for the fact that he was a freed slave and he was let go as a result of it. Also because I sold a lot of things, I traded a lot with the Spanish when the Spanish were here. And one of the instances that I was involved in was I was supposed to trade with them some flour. I didn't have it, so instead I traded rum. They ended up getting rowdy, caused some problems, and later I ended up in the garrison because I was not allowed to sell them liquor. Luckily, because we were one of the second most prominent families in town, I was able to get valet to come and help bail me out. So I was freed as a result of that. When I died, I'm buried somewhere here. There is no gravestone of where I was buried, but I was buried here. I had $10,000 in cash in the early 1800s. That was a lot of money. I had 11 slaves, and of course I had land holdings all throughout the St. Genevieve area.
My name is Vital St. Jean Beauvais. I was born in 1739. This is my wife Felicite. She was born in 1752. She's quite a bit younger than I. We were married in 1775 and moved to St. Genevieve in 1787. We came from Kaskaskia, and at that time we built a house which is still standing on Main Street, 20 South Main Street, a log plateau and terre house. And in 1796, a small child came to visit us. He was 7 years old. His name was Henry Marie Brackenridge, and his father was a judge in Pittsburgh, and he sent him down the river, down the Ohio River, and from there up to St. Genevieve with some voyagers, some boatmen. And Henry spent 3 years living with us, learning French and learning French customs, which is what his father wanted. What makes that an important story is that when Henry was in his later life, he wrote about his explorations, his surveying in western parts of the United States, but he also wrote about his early life in St. Genevieve, and he described St. Genevieve very, very clearly. He describes Felicite as being a rather stout, large woman who was very friendly, but also ruled the house strongly. He talks about myself, Vital, being thin and wiry, usually having a pipe hanging out his mouth, except when he was eating dinner. And He talks about what the house looked like, the orchards in the back, the food, some of the celebrations, for example, Christmas celebration, his going to school in St. Genevieve, and what is kind of a funny story, his winning a spelling contest at the end of the school year, and the prize was a China tea set, which is kind of funny because I suppose they expected a girl to win the spelling contest and he won it instead. Later in life, Henry came back to St. Genevieve. He was traveling through St. Louis and he decided to make a jog in his journey and come down to St. Genevieve. And when he got here, the family was at the Valley House. They were having a celebration. It happened to be their youngest daughter's wedding, who was Henry's playmate when he was in St. Genevieve. And her name was Zuzu, and Zuzu was getting married to one of the Valleys, and he just happened to arrive the night before the wedding, and so he stayed for the wedding. And that's pretty much the history of, did I leave anything out?
Not really. When he did arrive, then they recognized him. They all yelled, "La petite Anglaise," the small English. So they recognized him, they were glad to see him again and that he had come to visit. Yep.
Samuel the Englishman, which is an oddity for this little town, being that it's a French town, having an Englishman actually living in it. I arrived here right before George Washington had that little fiasco in the Ohio country at Fort Necessity. At that time he was a colonel in the Virginia militia. I was born in Virginia. I was born in the Tidewater area. My family, my parents died when I was very, very young. It is believed they died by scarlet fever. The family that took me in, all they were able to tell me was my name was Samuel. The day my birth date and my last name, I have no idea what it is. They tried to raise me as a sailor or a fisherman. I didn't have any sea legs. I would get sick in a boat real easily. I found out though I was a good hunter at a very young age. So I took to hunting. One day in what I think would be my late teens, I was out on a trail hunting and just decided, you know, I'm not going to go home. I'm going to follow this trail and see where it leads me. I ended up on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains, in the foothills. Eventually I worked my way up through the mountains and found myself on the Ohio River. I'm now in Ohio country, which belonged to France. So I'm in a touchy area at this time because this is right before the French and Indian War takes place. And I'm in French territory, and I'm an Englishman. I find a few Frenchmen I talk to, learn a little bit about the territory. I run into a few natives, learn a little bit more as I'm traveling. Eventually I end up on the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi River. I decided I was going to follow the Mississippi River north, and next thing you know, I'm at Fort de Chartres, French fort. Stayed there for a little while hunting for them. Found out there was a little village on the other side of the river, and next thing you know, I'm going across Mississippi and found the little village of St. Genevieve. Fell in love with the village, fell in love with the people. People liked me, you know, I offered my services. I told them I was a hunter and I could provide them food for them. He said, sure. The only two things you have to do though. One, you have to change your religion. Two, you have to be a member of the militia. At this time, since I was raised in Virginia, I am a member of the Anglican Church, Church of England. This is a Catholic town, so to stay here I'd have to become Catholic. I said, sure, I'll change. No big deal. I have no family, nothing to worry about. I'll become Catholic. And I ended up joining the militia. Eventually I became a scout for the militia. Militia had little problems here and there that we'd have to take care of, like a wayward child, or if there was a fugitive from some other town that was coming through the area, we'd have to go out and look for them. Track a few lost animals or something like that. But we were called up one time to go do something major. And at the time we were called up, St. Genevieve was underneath Spanish rule. So I'm an Englishman in a French town under Spanish rule, and I'm being called up to go fight. We were being sent north to a little place called Fort St. Carlos. Fort St. Carlos is in a town that most people know as St. Louis. We were going north to stop the British from taking control of the upper Mississippi River. This fight up here, a lot of people don't recognize it as the end of one of the last battles at the end of the Revolutionary War, because it wasn't between England and the Patriots, it was between England and Spain. 63 members of our militia left here and went north, and on May 26, 1780, the Battle of Fort St. Carlos took place. End of the battle, and we came home a short time later. We returned home with 62 members of our militia. For militia, that's fantastic. Usually militia is decimated and used as cannon fodder, and if a couple of men are left, that's great. But to come home with 62 members out of 63, that was fantastic. Upon returning home, I went back to doing what I did best, which was my hunting, trapping, fishing, dealing with the natives, and doing exactly what I always did. Unfortunately, on one of my trips out to one of the native villages, on my return home, I brought back something that we gave them to begin with. I came home with smallpox. I died in my bed. Since I had no family members, I died alone, but I was a member of the Catholic Church at this time, so I was allowed to be buried in this cemetery. In the back behind me, you won't see any gravestones. That was the pauper area, or where the members of the lower society would be buried. Near the front gate is where the higher members would be buried. I have no gravestone, so I was buried in the back, no family member. There's a small hill in the back here along the fence line. I like to think I'm buried there because I like to think that I'm an Englishman rising above the French.
I am Francois Genet. I was born in Kaskaskia, across the river there. Although there is some confusion on when that actually was. Some sources say I was born in 1761. Well, if this is true, then I was born a Frenchman. But other sources say I was born in 1767. Well, if that is true, then I was born an Englishman. Because in 1763, France had lost all the land east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain as a result of the French and Indian Wars. I don't recall which it was, whether it was 1761 or 1767, but I do remember the day that George Rogers Clark and his Virginians arrived in Kaskaskia. It was on the 4th of July, and the British garrison was having a big celebration. George Rogers Clark just walked right in as if he had an invitation, and he announced to the officers there that they were now his prisoners of war. And the British garrison surrendered without firing a shot. And now we all became Virginians. In 1786, I was elected captain of a company of militia from Kaskaskia in the Virginia militia. About 1790, my father decided to move across the river, and he had a house built just south of the Gabourey, right across from Le Grand Champ, the big field, right where his allotment was that he farmed. But he was growing old in age, and after a few years, he asked me to come over and take over operations, and he deeded this house to me. And so I brought my wife and my 7 children over to St. Genevieve, and then I became a Spaniard. Because before France had lost all the land east of the Mississippi River,
They had secretly made a treaty with Spain, giving to Spain all the land west of the Mississippi River. But it wasn't until 1769 that the Spanish even arrived to take things over. My plan was to open up a tavern in my father's house, but it needed some repairs, and so I contracted to have a stone wall built in front of the house and the roof to be repaired. However, I contracted an American to do the roof, and evidently he was confounded by the French Norman style of roof, and so he totally replaced it with a new roof. This has confused historic architects to this day, because they can't figure out what a French vertical log house is doing with an American-style roof on it. When I applied for the license to open up a tavern, the Spanish commandant here in St. Louis refused to give it to me. He said, we already have enough taverns and billiard halls in St. Genevieve. But then, in 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte took Louisiana back from Spain, but didn't tell anybody. And then in 1803, he sold us to the Americans across the river. They had a big celebration in San Luis for this. On the 9th of March, the Spanish company marched down from the fort on the hill to in front of the commandant's house, and they lined up there and they lowered the Spanish flag and they raised the French flag to symbolize the exchange from Spain to France. And then they went home. The next day, the Spanish company of soldiers came back down. They lined up in front of the commandant's house. They lowered the French flag and they raised the American flag, and now we have become Americans. And so I took advantage of this change in government, and I opened up my father's house into a tavern where travelers could find repose and refreshment. And I named it the Green Tree Tavern, because among the Americans that was a common symbol of a place for travelers that could find shelter and rest. I've been mentioned in a couple of books over the years. One, an Englishman who was traveling along, he stopped at my inn. He said it was run by a lively Frenchman. And then he went on to praise my wife's coffee as the best coffee he had ever had in all America. Another gentleman by the name of Henry Marie Brackenridge mentions me in his writings. He was traveling up through Louisiana in 1811. He had crossed the Mississippi River at Cape Girardeau, and he was coming up, and he stopped at my inn. He and his traveling companions, when I saw them, were dressed very rough, and I did not think that they had the money to pay for the inn. But I did take care of their horses, and I put them in the stable, and I fed them and rubbed them down, and I pointed to the shed behind the house for them to stay. The next morning, his companion was looking for his trousers, but they were nowhere to be found. They had searched the whole place, and they did finally found little scraps of material by a rat hole in the shed. And so they assumed that the rats had carried off the gentleman's trousers. Well, Mr. Brackenridge, of course, changed in his gentleman's clothes in a fine chapeau and fine broadcloth suit, because he was going to visit friends in St. Genevieve. When I saw him the next morning, I was aghast at the faux pas. I put a fine gentleman in my shed for the night. To make amends, I offered to give him any room in the house. But when the Beauvais family had discovered that La Petite Anglaise had come back, you see, Mr. Brackenridge, at the age of 8, was sent to St. Genevieve to live with the Beauvais to learn the French language. He said when he arrived at St. Genevieve, the only French he knew was oui and no. After 3 years of living here, he said the only English he could remember was yes and no. And so he had spent time here, but then returned many years later, and when the Beauvais discovered he was here, they gave him accommodations in their home on Main Street. After the Americans came, many of them belonged to the Masonic Order. Most of them here in St. Genevieve were members of the lodge in Kaskaskia, But that meant that they had to cross the Mississippi River to go to their lodge meetings. And of course, the Mississippi River is not always accommodating to travelers. And so they decided to try to form a lodge here in St. Genevieve. They petitioned the Grand Lodge in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for a charter. And with the support of the lodge in Kaskaskia, they were granted that charter. And in September of 1808, they had the first Masonic meeting here in St. Genevieve in the Green Tree Tavern. And so then I became a Mason. And so they existed for a few years and then disbanded, but this was the first Masonic lodge west of the Mississippi River, even earlier than the one that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark formed in St. Louis. In 1834, I passed away, and here I was placed in the city cemetery where I remain to today. But my house has actually outlasted me. Eventually, the state of Missouri acquired my house and opened it up as a state historic site where they would have tours periodically. And now there is rumors that it will become part of the national park, the new national park here in St. Genevieve.
So, the guy I'm portraying, his name is Nicholas Lachance. He was born in 1733 over in France. He studied the law, and he also studied the trade of becoming a master carpenter. So he could build furniture, cabinets, and fancy things. 1750, he joined the French army and was sent to the New World and was stationed down in New Orleans. The French-Indian War was going on at that time, so he was in the Southern campaign fighting to protect that port, as New Orleans was a big trading post area back then. After that, he moved up to this area to Kaskaskia's village, met a woman named Maria, married her, and they had 11 children. He also served as a judge for multiple terms in the courts here because he was skilled in the law. He was also the local handyman because he was very skilled with carpentry. Skip forward a few more years. In 1778, General George Rogers Clark of the Continental Army comes here during the Revolutionary War. They join together and go to Fort St. Carlos, which is right where the arch sits today, and fight the British that have come down from Canada and the Indians that fought on their behalf. They also fought the other battle just up from there in Cahokia, and then they eventually worked their way up to modern-day Detroit, Michigan, to Fort Detroit to fight the British and the Indians up there that were coming down from Canada. After that, he moved down, or came back home to Kaskaskia, seeing that it had been severely damaged by the flooding, which gives you Kaskaskia Island today. Back then, the river was on our side, and that whole thing was just one piece of land. Today, the river has been changed, so it's on the Illinois side, which gives you the island. They moved here for higher ground purposes here in St. Genevieve, and then they lived here until she died in 96, I believe, and he died in 99.
Interesting.
So that's all the information I could find on him. Had he lived in Philadelphia or Boston, I'm sure there'd be a lot more information on him because he sounded like a really interesting guy coming from Europe and then going from basically top to bottom almost in the American continent here, from New Orleans to basically Canada, because Detroit's very close to Canada.
Which tombstone's his?
His stone and his wife's stone do not exist anymore. But they are buried in the graveyard here, but their stones are non-existent. Yeah. There are two other American Revolutionary War guys buried here that don't have stones, and they have very, very little information on them. Apparently, flooding over the years, the cemetery used to go a little bit farther down to the flats because there was no Casey Hall across the road back then, and there used to be about 3,000 headstones, and now you got about 250 left. So the flooding had destroyed it all, and developments have,
Well, and then even in here, some of them are, I mean,
they're
30 years
away.
ago, there's less here now than there were 30 years ago.
Yeah. During the daytime, you can see several of them just kind of stacked up, so they're broken into pieces, and they can't really do anything with them, so they're just kind of stacked in piles. So there's a lot, there may be some right there, but we don't know because there's no stone left anymore.
Mon père fait bâtir maison, j'entends la moulette taco. La pépéture à trois pignons, tic-tic, tic-tic-toc. J'entends la moulette taco, j'entends la moulette taco. J'entends la moulette tic-tic-toc, j'entends la moulette taco. La pépéture à trois pignons, j'entends la moulette taco. Sur toi, je dire qui la trouve. Tiki-taka, j'entends la moulette, tic-tac, j'entends la moulette, j'entends la moulette, tic-tac, j'entends la moulette.
In 1935, the people of St. Genevieve got together and said, let's clean up the cemetery. And so a big effort was underway, cleaned up the cemetery. The state of Missouri said, okay, I guess he can come back. So they went out to the new cemetery and brought him up here and buried him here. But he happened to be very
So I am the ghost of Jean Ferdinand Rosier, and my story is that I arrived here in Saint-Geneviève in February of 1811 with my business partner Jean-James Audubon. As you know, Jean-James Audubon made a name for himself as an ornithologist and an artist who produced the lithographic book of the birds of America, some 432 illustrations of the birds of North America that were unfamiliar to him back in France, which is where he and I started. Our fathers, being businessmen in France, helped us to establish a business partnership and send us here to the new country to establish some branch of the family businesses back in Nantes, France. We had a contract between the two of us, a mutually binding and agreed upon contract where we were 50% partners in whatever decisions, whatever profit and whatever losses that we made here in the United States. It was the prospect of coming to Sainte-Geneviève, or Sainte-Genevieve, I think you say here in English, that we saw the prospects for establishing a good business. When we arrived here in Sainte Genevieve in February of 1811, we arrived with 300 barrels of whiskey as collateral for as merchandise to sell and get our business started. But Audubon, he was not so enthralled with Sainte Genevieve as was I. I was so happy to finally find some people who spoke French, having been already 3, 4, maybe 5 years out in the East dealing with the English-speaking people. English would not being my first language. It's very difficult for me to envision setting up any sort of business with my French accent. So Sainte Genevieve was a welcome sight when we finally arrived here. Audubon, he leaves after just a mere 6 weeks of being here, that he returns back to Kentucky. Yet here in St. Genevieve we have any number of establishments using the Audubon name. We have Audubon Street, we have Audubon Estates, we have Audubon Hotel, Audubon. Everywhere you turn around is Audubon. But the Rozier name lives on also. We know the name well here in St. Genevieve, and I am proud to have been the great-great-grandfather of many of the Roziers that you know here in St. Genevieve County and Perry counties. So I thank you for listening to my talk this evening.
So good evening. Good evening. My name is John Scott, and I was Missouri's first representative. And I was born in 1782 in Virginia. And then from there I moved to Vincennes, Indiana. And by then, because my parents had moved us there, and I went to what is now Princeton University, studied law. Although there's no record of me ever having graduated from there. But I did pick up enough education for law that I came back home, which by then my parents had moved from Vincennes to St. Genevieve. So my parents are living here. I came here in 1805 and I opened up my law practice. In 1810, I met my first wife, Catherine, and we had one daughter, Elizabeth. And I was known to not back away from a duel. In fact, the story goes that I once challenged 5 different guys to a duel before breakfast one morning. Nothing ever came of that, however, but in 1811, I was the second for a gentleman by the name of Thomas Crittenden, who had a dispute with the brother of Dr. Walter Fenwick. Dr. Walter Fenwick lived in the little house that's catty-corner to the cemetery entrance. And in that duel, only one shot was fired, and Dr. Fenwick went down and died the next morning. So that was in 1811. In 1812, I was designated as the first attorney general or first attorney for the Missouri Territory. Of course, Missouri was not a state at that time. And in 1812. In 1815, it was a bad year for me because I lost my wife in childbirth, and then 2 months later, my daughter died. So they're both buried right here. In 1816, I entered the area of politics, and it was a very contentious election between myself and a gentleman by the name of Rufus Easton. And of course, elections were run differently back in those days. The votes had to come in by horseback or whatever before they got to the polling place where the votes were counted. And when the votes were first counted, I had lost by 7 votes. However, there was still one precinct that hadn't come in yet. So when that, it was up around the St. Louis area, and I was very good friends with a gentleman by the name of Henry Clay, and who kind of campaigned for me. Well, when these last precinct came in, I won by 15 votes. So Henry Clay declared me the winner, and which Easton was not real happy about. But I was declared the winner, so I got to go to Washington. But I traveled by horseback to Washington, so it took me 30 days to get there. Well, Easton traveled by horseback also, and by the time, or when I got there, he wasn't very far behind because he was going to make his case with the representatives that he should have been the one there, not me. Well, what happened is there was a very spirited debate within the House, and they declared the seat vacant and sent us both back to Missouri for a re-election. Well, in the re-election, in the meantime, Easton had been accused of some financial indiscrepancies, you might say, and so in the second election, I actually won by 372 votes. So I came to Washington, and instead of living in a guest house or an inn, I chose to live in one of the fanciest hotels in Washington, because that way I could hobnob with the other senators and representatives that were there, because I was there to vie for statehood for Missouri. And so, which we thought was only going to take a couple of years. Well, it ended up 1820 before the issue actually came to a vote, but because of the Missouri Compromise, which had to do with the issue of slavery, it held it up. But finally, Missouri was granted statehood in 1821, mostly through my efforts. So I was very popular back home. So when I ran again in 1822, I was declared a very big winner at that time, over 1,000 votes difference. And then in 1824, I ran again, and again was very successful. So I stayed in the House of Representatives in 1824. 1824 was also a presidential year, and that year the race was between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And most of Missouri kind of liked Andrew Jackson, but Henry Clay wanted John Quincy Adams. And so I think he had a big influence on my vote. I ended up voting for John Quincy Adams, who did win the election, by the way, but the people back in Missouri were not real happy. So when I ran again in 1826, I was pretty soundly defeated. I moved back to St. Genevieve, started up my law practice again, and was a very successful lawyer, was known as a gentleman that was very honest, fair, although I did at times come into court. I was wearing a cord around my neck, and one end had a derringer on it, and the other had a dagger. And in one case, there was a gentleman that everybody knew was guilty. I mean, all the evidence pointed toward him. And yet when the jury came back, they came back with a verdict of not guilty. And the judge said, how can you possibly come back with a not guilty verdict? And they said, well, John Scott told us to come back with a not guilty verdict, and that was good enough for us. So he was very well respected and very honest. There were times when he was actually given lots of money during the times that he would take horseback ride from Missouri to Washington, D.C. and have to deliver money, and he never took any of that money. In fact, there were times when he was even down to his last dollar, but he always was honest enough to turn the money over. So he was very well respected. In the time that he was in the House of Representatives, he was able to petition Congress and get it approved for thousands of acres of land. He was known as the father of public education in Missouri. He was able to get that land for public schools, first University of Missouri, and also a place to build the first Capitol in Missouri. So lived out the rest of my life, remarried, and we had 5 children from the second marriage, and I died in 1861, and I'm buried there next to my first wife and daughter there. So that completes my story. Now the gentlemen normally here, if you've never been here before, those 2 big monuments there belong to Senator Lewis Lynn, who was the model senator from Missouri. And so you've heard that story, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he was dug up twice and replanted here, and I think he's home to stay now.
Then nobody's asked to move him lately anyway.
So, well, thanks for coming this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Anyway, I'm the spirit of Odile Valet. I'm buried here. My husband Felix Valet is buried on the other side, and I was born in 1804. My maiden name was Duprat. My parents were wealthy merchants, and they were also in the lead mining business, which made them also very wealthy. And through my lifetime, they continued to give me a stipend from their lead mining business, which kind of made me an independently wealthy woman. In those days, women were dependent on their husbands for their sustenance, so that gave me a little bit of freedom at my time. But when I was 17, I married Felix Valet, and a year later, when I was 18, we had our first child, who was Louis Felix Valet, and he's buried right here. He was our only child, and unfortunately he died at the age of 33 and never marrying, which made us without any grandchildren, which made me very unhappy. I didn't have anyone to spoil at that time. So a few years later, Felix and I purchased a house right here on Merchant Street, at 2nd and Merchant Street. Beautiful stone house, stone building. And we ran a business out of that house. We divided it in two, put our business on one side, residence on the other side. And the business was known as Menard and Valet Trading Firm. Pierre Menard was our partner. He was from across the river, from Port Kaskaskia. And we ran a very successful business there for until about the middle 1830s, when Felix decided to close the store and go out of the mercantile business. He then went into other businesses with other Frenchmen from the St. Louis area and so forth. But Felix died in 1877 at the age of 77 and was buried here in the cemetery. And he left me with lots of money, a very wealthy widow at that time. And so I was able to donate 3/4 of the money to build this big Catholic church that you see up on the corner here. And that made me happy because it was a very civic thing to do. And unfortunately, they closed this cemetery in 1881. The city said it was a health hazard, and it was a full cemetery. It doesn't look like it today because it looks like it's just barely a few stones here and there, but most of the stones have either disappeared or have been broken. Most of the iron crosses have just disintegrated. And I wanted to be buried next to Felix, but they said no burial. So since I died in 1894, which is a long way from 1881, I didn't know what to do. I wanted to be buried next to Felix, so I made the city an offer they couldn't refuse. I offered them a big tract of land on the outskirts of town for a new cemetery, and I said, I'll give you the land if you let me be buried here in the cemetery, and they agreed. So I was the last burial here in the cemetery. So I guess that's one of most people remember me for that particular feat, if you so say.